A big hand to all the actors in that one. Woo! Thank you so much. You brought that alive. I'm going to tell you that I have struggled to get my head around this passage. Even though it's one of the most famous passages, right, in all the scriptures. Here's this lawyer, and he's talking with Jesus, and he shows that he understands the heart of all the scriptures. He at least identifies the heart of all the scriptures. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then when Jesus says, yes, go and do that, he asks Jesus, but who is my neighbor? And there's the kind of going feeling about this passage, the going impression of this passage, is that Jesus responds to him, love everyone. Go love everyone. Everyone's your neighbor. But that's not actually what Jesus says in response, even if that's the general impression. So look again at the lawyer's question to try to suss out why Jesus doesn't answer it directly like that. He says, but who is my neighbor? And do you feel how he's trying to get Jesus to split people up? He's trying to say, well, there's a lot of people out there, Jesus. Could you build some lines around them and let me know? Kind of rank them for me, if you would. If we could just, it's kind of already a natural kind of aisle here, and just love on these people. These people, maybe like if you're having a good day. And like those people in the back, just don't worry about it. That's how else can you read his question? Jesus, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus does not oblige him with a straight answer. And I think we might be seeing the wisdom of Jesus, that Jesus doesn't know all the people that this lawyer is going to encounter even tomorrow. How could he give him a list of who to treat as a neighbor? How could he give any of us a list? And furthermore, if he gave us a list, how would that actually help us to love anyone? So instead of telling the lawyer whom to see as a neighbor, Jesus goes into the territory of how to see a neighbor. Who in the parable does a really good job of following the law? The Levite does a really good job of following the law. Who else does a really good job of following the law?
The donkey.
Doug, I'm going to give you that one after we had the whole conversation about Balaam and his donkey a few weeks ago. Who's the other obvious choice? Come on now. Yeah, thank you. Yes, the priest does a very nice job of following the law. Who does a good job of showing love to their neighbor? The Samaritan? You guys like the role of the Samaritan in this? He's a dirty foreigner. That's just offensive that you like what the Samaritan is up to. Jesus makes you say that you like the actions of that dirty foreigner. I told you that the parable ends up being, in my eyes, the parable ends up being about how to see. And we've covered that mostly because the way to see is not like the priest and the Levite, it's like that Samaritan character. So Jesus is saying, don't be like these two first characters who follow the tidy social norms, but be like this third character who follows mercy. But why didn't Jesus just tell a parable about one priest who went by on the other side and was being a bad priest, and then another priest who went up and bandaged the wounds and poured oil and cared for the man, the good priest? And then the lesson would be like the good priest. Because it's easy to care for people like you. So the Good Samaritan is not just a story saying, love everyone. Everyone's your neighbor. It's not that simple. And it's not just a story saying, follow the people who are like you, who are teaching you about goodness. Instead, it has even this other layer, which is, I think, is why it's hard to grasp the depth of it. Because why bring in this Samaritan at all? I think the parable is meant to be intentionally meant to be offensive to the audience. Maybe you're not really offended by it at the moment, but just give me a minute. You're not offended because you don't know any Samaritans, and you're not a priest. But try translating the parable into today's culture. Who's the dirty foreigner today? Migrant. A migrant. Yeah, someone just popped into your mind when I said that. You know you're not supposed to say it. You're not even supposed to think of anyone when I say who's the dirty foreigner. But you did. Someone comes to mind. And who's the priest and the Levite today? Who's the person who always speaks graciously and is well dressed as a rule and has an appropriate home? We're not really supposed to answer that question either, are we?
But they didn't make the Samaritan one of their own either. They could have made the Samaritan one of themselves, who was not someone, as in, what if that was, I'll go out on a limb, a proud boy that stopped?
What if
that would be hard, because that's not a foreigner.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you say that, because a Samaritan wasn't quite a foreigner either. They were, if you read, you can go back and read the opening page of the bulletin if you didn't get a chance to, but they were sort of like cousins, dirty cousins. The parable it's extra offensive today because we're not even supposed to name those in-groups and out-groups. It's all supposed to be just invisible, those distinctions. And, you know, it's obviously, it's not good to call anyone a dirty foreigner. I don't think Jesus would want us using that language. But it's also not good if somebody is quietly, secretly in that category, to pretend that category doesn't exist. Because how could we ever address the problem if we can't say something about it? So I like this language, which I was taught, that in every culture, New Hampshire, the United States, in every culture, there's a culturally dominant center. And certain identities are within that culturally dominant center. So in America, what identities are in the center? Being male, being white, being straight, kind of depending on the moment. Usually being a veteran is not in the center. Usually not having been a veteran, not having served is in the center. High education, a high level of education, that puts you in the center, in the culturally dominant center. And then there are identities outside the center. Being an immigrant, native born, that's in the center. Being an immigrant is outside the center. Being any other skin color other than white is outside the center. Being a prisoner is outside the center. Being a felon or having a record is outside the center. Being Native American is outside the center. So that's this idea of a culturally dominant center, and it allows you to describe where different identities are positioned, and having or acting like that identity in the center. Understand, having or acting like, sort of performing the identities of the center, gives you more access. And having or acting like the identities outside the dominant cultural center diminishes your access. So that's a useful picture, and it allows us to discuss our different social locations without calling anyone a dirty foreigner, but saying we can see how these are acting and being responded to in our culture. But one thing that goes along with this description I was taught, this way of understanding community and culture, is that no matter what your identity is, no matter where your identities place you in the cultural dominance and or outside the cultural center, the way you avoid personal trouble is by being quiet about the whole thing. The way you avoid personal trouble is by keeping the status quo, by don't betray where you are in this pattern. And so that's why to the Levites and the priests, it's so awful what Jesus says, because he even mentions that there are Samaritans. He even mentions that you could have an identity outside the cultural center. And he highlights someone who's outside the culturally dominant center. Interestingly, if you doubted that we would find this parable offensive today, the model that I just described to you would be illegal, actually illegal for me to teach in our public schools right now, or to a town office, or to anyone contracted in any way to serve one of our schools or to work for one of our municipalities. That's how skittish we are about naming any of this, that we've made it illegal. We cannot reconstruct the parable today, except in church. And in contrast to that skittishness, Jesus says to the lawyer, he talks to the lawyer, and he pokes his finger right into the middle of the mess. And he says, a Levite, a white American, a professor, a businessman, avoided the beaten traveler, and a Samaritan, a Black American, a undocumented immigrant, a homeless person who suffers from addiction, that person came close and tended the wounds of the person in need. Do you see now how Jesus is just betraying the whole context of the conversation? The lawyer's like, this is just a conversation about who to love. And Jesus, I asked you who to love, and then you say everyone, wink, wink. And we both know that when you say everyone, you just mean everyone inside the box, except neither of us actually has to say out loud that there's a box. Just keep it on the down low. And then we both just go on our ways. And I just keep loving tidy Jews. I just keep loving tidy Christians. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus goes down, 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 layer by layer, and he makes the conversation explicitly, rudely, about how to see your neighbors explicitly by way of betraying the culturally dominant center. Almost every identity that I inhabit personally is in the culturally dominant center in America. And one of the amazing teachings is you can't leave. The goal is not to go for me to leave the culturally dominant center and go somewhere else, because I can't do it. But you can do what Jesus taught in this parable, which is to betray the culturally dominant center, to betray the rule that says, let's just quietly keep pretending that everyone is just us.
Can you change the name of it then?
You want to change the name of the parable?
Instead of the,
Yeah.
and only good Samaritan, a caring Samaritan, it implies that the other Samaritans are not good, that there's one good Samaritan.
The good Samaritan.
A unique special Samaritan.
I always like trying on different names for a parable, so I applaud that. Let's keep. I think we should keep asking if there's another name we could use for this. Well, after Jesus, I'm going to wrap up. After Jesus gives this whole parable, and he gets the lawyer to respond, well, the one who was a good neighbor is the one who showed mercy. You forced me, Jesus, to assent to this betrayal of the quiet system of niceness. Jesus says, go and do likewise. And that's all we get. That's the end of the passage. Does the lawyer go forth to continue betraying the culturally dominant center and breaking down boundaries so that he can go anywhere and show mercy and see a neighbor in anyone? And will we go and do likewise? Will we transgress those boundaries with Jesus in order to love anyone? We can only do it. We will only succeed if we allow the parable of the Good Samaritan in us to be more than a parable of love everyone.